All right, I am going to go ahead and get started as it is about 1 minute past the hour. So first, I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. My name is Michaela Morris, and I'm an Oceans Associate with Environment America Research and Policy Center. We are a nationwide network of state-based nonprofits that are dedicated to protecting our clean air, clean water, and open spaces like the ocean. The ways that we do this, we investigate problems, we craft solutions, we educate the public and decision makers, and essentially help the public make their voices heard in our local, state, and national debates over the quality of our environment and ultimately our lives. So first, thank you again, everyone, for joining us tonight to hear about the connections between protecting our special ocean habitats like the Florida Keys and building a healthy future for our oceans. I hope today's discussion will give you a better understanding of the threats that are facing our oceans and how we can protect these special places for generations to come. Before we jump into the speaking program that we have planned with our two experts from Shedd Aquarium, I want to share a little bit about how I got into this work. So I grew up on the seacoast of New Hampshire, very small town, and that childhood really made me love the ocean. When I was little, I could spend all day exploring the crabs and barnacles and clams and tide pools. And then as I grew older, I started to do a little bit of diving with a mask and snorkel, and I caught glimpses of all the wonders underneath the surface. I've seen fish as long as my forearm fitting their way through seaweed, lobsters on rocks, and seals surfacing with fish gleaming in their mouths. Unfortunately, that world that I know and love, and so many of you know and love underwater, is facing a lot of threats that could change our oceans as we know them. Oil and gas drilling and climate change and overfishing have all taken their toll on the ecosystems and habitats that make up a healthy ocean. So today we are going to talk about some of these threats, but we'll also focus more on the tools we have to safeguard and restore a healthy ocean. Marine protected areas with a specific focus on the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary is one of these tools. These sanctuaries in our oceans are like national parks on land, except they're underwater. They preserve our notable ecosystems and wildlife, and if used properly, can help build resilience in our oceans and across the globe. That's why we'll also be talking about the idea that we need to set a bold target to protect more of our oceans. We'll learn more about the importance of marine sanctuaries to ecosystems in and around the Florida Keys and the ways that we can use policy to secure more protections in our oceans. Specifically, we want to protect 30% of our oceans and 30% of our lands by 2030. Today, you're going to hear from Dr. Lynn Waterhouse, Shedd Aquarium research biologist, share her experiences researching predator fish in the Caribbean and how ocean conservation can help protect vulnerable fish, sea animals, and underwater habitats for generations to come. You'll also listen to Andrea Densham, Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy at Shedd, talk about some ocean conservation success stories and how policy can help foster those success stories. We are going to wrap up tonight with a question and answer session where we'll tell you how you can help us protect the Florida Keys. During the Q&A, you can use the chat function to ask your questions. Great, so now I will turn it over to Lynn to share a little bit of her research and some of her stories studying some of our most wonderful marine underwater habitats.
Thank you. Yeah, so to start with, you can go to the next one. So I work for Shedd Aquarium, which is in fact in Chicago, but I'm part of a research center next where we focus on conservation research and action. And there's actually a whole team of us. Next. There that focuses on different aspects of the ecosystem. There's also a team that complements us that studies freshwater, but this is our marine team here. And we work in the Bahamas. And Shedd does this because it's our mission to spark compassion, curiosity, and conservation for the aquatic world. And that goes beyond just the walls at Shedd Aquarium in Chicago. Next. And how we do this for the marine team, at least, is we have Shedd's second facility, which is the RV Coral Reef 2, which was a custom built research vessel that is based out of Miami that we use to get to the Bahamas to conduct our research programs. Next. So we work in the Bahamas. We sail from Miami to the Bahamas. All of the land in the Bahamas is highlighted here in pink, and it includes everything north of Cuba, all the way to the east. The next country you would have is Turks and Caicos. And then on the west, you have Florida. Next. And the Bahamas are actually also trying to target, they're working on the 20 by 2020 and also 30 by 2030. And this is where they are in terms of MPAs as of 2017. So all of the colors, orange, purple, and green, those are all different MPAs. Next. All right, so now I'm going to shift to focus on some MPA success stories for the Caribbean and Florida. Next. So just a little bit of background about MPAs. So some of the benefits for the environment, they protect critical habitat, ecosystems, and species. The idea being inside the marine protected area, those fish that are protected could grow bigger and older. Bigger fish are often really important for the success of the species. You can protect critical life stages or entire life cycles if the species lives its entire life inside the MPA, and also provide a buffer against climate change. Next. There's also social economic benefits, which include protecting ecosystem services such as buffers from hurricanes, providing non-extractive jobs like ecotourism, protect recreation areas, and it can also increase fisheries production. And as a fisheries scientist, this is kind of the angle I'm going to talk about today, is some important fish species. And it does this in two ways. So from this image here on the left is inside an MPA where you have lots of big adult fish, and on the right is an area open to fishing, and you have spillover both in terms of larvae, so that's the eggs and the baby fish, and adults. When it gets so crowded in the MPA, they move to that area next to it. And when we talk about designing MPAs to protect fisheries, there's kind of three ways you can design them. You could protect the entire life cycle of a species, particularly for a sedentary species. That works really well. You could protect juvenile habitat with the notion that getting those fish to grow from babies to juveniles and pass into reproductive adults is really the important time point. Or you could protect the areas in which they reproduce. And for some species, this is actually very critical habitat. Next. But when we talk about protecting reproductive habitat, it's actually really more complex than that for some species. So I'm going to focus on three species that are important to Florida historically, along with much of the Caribbean. So the Caribbean spiny lobster, queen conch, and Nassau grouper. Now, when they reproduce, they have eggs that then turn into larvae, so babies. And for the lobster, they stay as those larvae for 5 to 9 months, floating with the currents. And the larvae control where they go somewhat, but they, by and large, the currents are moving them around. For queen conch, it's 14 to 42 days. And for Nassau grouper, it's 35 to 50 days. Next. Now I'm going to focus a little bit more on the queen conch. So for those of you who aren't familiar with them, it's a gastropod. It's got a heavy shell. They live up to 30 years. And their reproduction is density dependent. So in a given area, you have to have enough conch in the vicinity for them to find each other, since they're a slow moving rock essentially, to reproduce. And so this is why they're not successfully reproducing in a lot of places, because there's not enough of them. They lay eggs which hatch in 3 to 5 days, and their larval duration again is 14 to 42 days. Next. So in the Bahamas, they're still actually fished. It's one of the last places that fish them, because throughout the rest of much of their range, they're not doing so well. So they're listed under Appendix 2 by CITES, and collection's been prohibited in Florida for 30 years. And it's a very important fishery in the Bahamas, but there's evidence of declining populations. So there's a lot of in-country organizations such as the Bahamas National Trust and Community Conch Project working to conserve this species. I'm not going to play this music video now, but if you have a chance after this, you should Google Conch Gone, the music video. It was basically the top Bahamian artists across multiple music genres got together to record a music video and make a song with the purpose of encouraging people to conserve this species, which is really impressive. Next. So focusing on 2 places in the Bahamas. So one of those MPAs is the Exuma Keys Land and Sea Park, which is shown in the top box and then zoomed in panel B. And what one of my colleagues, Dr. Andy Cow from SHED, found out is that from 2011 to 2016, there was a 71% decline in adult abundances. And what was happening is there are adults in the park and they're reproducing and they're sending their larvae during those 14 to 42 days outside the park. So they're repopulating open areas that are fished, which is great for fishermen. But the problem is that they have very little self-recruitment, which means their larvae, when they release them into the water, very few of them actually settle back inside the Exuma Keys Land and Sea Park. So it's a problem where the conch are aging and basically they're getting old and dying and there's no new young ones that are going to replenish the population. So it'll be really problematic for the Exuma Keys Land and Sea Park, and this highlights why a network of MPAs is so important. Next slide. Dr. Cow did another study that was recently published with Souza in 2020, which was really exciting. And they actually found Cayman Bank, which is in fact part of the Bahamas, has a bunch of adult conch that of different ages. So there's successful recruitment of larvae to Cayman Bank from that population on Cayman Bank, and global ocean circulation models show that the larvae from Cayman Bank make it to Florida. So that's great news for Florida, but they also make it to the rest of the Bahamas. Cayman Bank on that map of MPAs for the Bahamas was actually one of the MPAs up for listing. They're still deciding exactly how to work it out, but this is a really exciting possible refuge for queen conch and something that will benefit Florida. Next. I'm gonna shift gear now and talk about a predatory fish. I realize the first one wasn't a fish, but it's an important fishery. So NASA grouper in the Cayman Islands, and this is a project run by the Department of the Environment of the Cayman Islands along with Reef Environmental Education Foundation. And they have some institutional partners. Next. So the NASA grouper, for those of you who aren't familiar, they're about 4 feet long max length. They're normally around 3 feet. They're a top reef predator, and they're in the Caribbean and tropical Western Atlantic. Next. And for those of you who have been in the water with them, this is the experience you might have had. So they're a very friendly, very curious fish. And again, they're a top predator, so they're not afraid of humans. The only thing that can really kill an adult NASA grouper besides humans would be a shark. And most of the year, they're really smart. They live solitary lives, but they have a unique reproductive behavior, which puts them at risk to fisheries. So this map, prior one. So this map shows all of the known historical spawning sites for NASA grouper. So during the winter, for most of the Caribbean, Bermuda does something different. It's because in Bermuda, they spawn in the summer when it's the warmest, but for the rest of the Caribbean, it's in the winter when it's the coolest. And it's after a specific moon. The fish will gather in the exact same spot year after year on islands. So once fishermen figure this out, super easy to fish them. The historical largest aggregation that was ever quantified by scientists was in the 1970s in Cat Key, Bimini, which was 30,000 to 100,000 individuals. Next. Now this lower part of the panel shows in 2008 how many of those sites remained. The circles around Cuba are actually hollow circles because people didn't know what the status in Cuba was at the time because of how hard it was to get in there to conduct scientific studies and the lack of information flow. But the main point is you can see a lot of these sites have disappeared. And that is because when it's time to spawn, all of the adult grouper come together in one spot. So it's super easy to fish them. They're focused on reproducing. They're not focused on not getting caught. And fishermen know once they find them, they come back year after year and catch them. So as a result, they're protected by multiple agencies, both inside the US and internationally. Next. So I'm going to tell the story of the Cayman Islands, and they're located south of Cuba. So on the other side of Cuba from the Bahamas. They're made up of 3 islands, and in particular, I'm going to talk about Little Cayman, the middle of the 3 islands. Next. So on the island of Little Cayman, there's a spawning site on the west end. Next. And this spawning site was actually discovered in 2001. Prior to that, fishermen in the 1980s, they'd come to the Department of Environment concerned about their declining catches. In 1994, they abandoned the fishing site they had used on the east end of the island, which was a spawning site, because the fish no longer went there. They were gone. 2001, they rediscovered a site. They thought it was 7,000 to 8,000 fish. 2 years later, probably 2,000 fish remained, so the country stepped in and put a variety of protections in place, including creating a MPA around the spawning grounds. I'm gonna cut through the long story and tell you it worked. They did one better in 2016, and instead of having renewable protections, which is the way it worked in the Caymans, they put permanent legislation in place, which is something to really applaud the Cayman Islands for. Next. And this is what it looks like there. This video was shot by Berkeley White for the Grouper Moon Project and Reef in 2018. And for those of you who are familiar with NASA Grouper, you might be thinking, wait, those don't all look like NASA Grouper. They're normally a different color. That's true. When it's time to spawn, they change color. So this site is accessed via the Department for Environment vessel. They're the only boat allowed to visit the spawning site. Again, other vessels aren't allowed in that area. And it's in about 100 feet of water as it drops really deep, and the fish all gather, and it's absolutely fantastic to see. In 2020, when we went back there, we estimated that there was 8,000 fish, making it the largest documented spawning aggregation anywhere in the world. Next. So the message, though, for Little Cayman is it took 20 years to recover the population to those 2001 levels when they first found it. So the pre-fishing levels. So protections work, but they take time. It wasn't protect it 1 year and the population rebounds the next. It actually took 10 years for that population to budge from the 2,000 fish approximately. So it wasn't until after 2011 that it actually increased above that 2,000 number. And a reminder that NASA grouper have pelagic offspring with a larval period of 35 to 50 days. And we know from circulation models and from putting drifters in the water that the Caymans are connected to other parts of the Caribbean. Also, genetic studies have showed us this. So it's possible that the Cayman Island NASA grouper populations are benefiting Cuba, which in turn could be benefiting Florida. So this just reiterates the importance of connectivity and having multiple MPAs throughout the Caribbean and Florida. If you want to benefit things in one place, you need to benefit them everywhere for a lot of these species. Next. And it turns out that in Florida, in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, it's actually in important spawning areas for a variety of species. In particular, NOAA has done studies in the past to look at the Tortugas Ecological Reserve, Riley's Hump, and the Western Dry Rocks area. And during those cruises, they've observed a variety of grouper and snapper spawning. Some of the really exciting ones for me are black grouper, which are even bigger than NASA grouper, and Goliath grouper, the largest grouper out there, along with mutton snapper, which they've done extensive studies on. And it turns out that these spawning sites used by grouper tend to be used by other grouper and other snapper species. So when you protect a habitat for one of these species, odds are is you're protecting a habitat for other species that spawn. They've also seen queen conch and spiny lobster, so back to those important invertebrate fisheries. Next. And they've done more global circulation models to show that the Florida Keys are connected to both the Gulf of Mexico and the southeast coast of the US. So when you protect spawning sites for these species in the Florida Keys, you're actually helping those species and the populations rebound outside. So again, really important to think about connectivity between MPAs. Next. So just some takeaways from the things I've said today. Just when you're talking about MPAs, or if you're discussing MPAs with people, just to remind them that recovery of populations takes time. It's not a fast thing, especially if you have pelagic larvae. 1 year you might get a good amount of recruitment, so a good amount of juveniles coming in, and other years you might get zero. That's just how it works. So it's really important to have a network of these MPAs to connect larval spillover to make sure that at each area we're getting young babies so that we can have future adults and future spawners, so future reproductive adults. And areas outside the MPAs can also benefit from the MPAs themselves. So protecting Florida species requires protecting connected areas throughout the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. So thank you. And now you'll hear from Andrea.
Yeah, thank you again, Lynn. That was great. And turn it right over to Andrea.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lynn and Michaela. This is fantastic. Oops, you can go to the next slide. Next one. Looks like I got you the wrong set of slides here. So we're gonna pass on the slides because these actually weren't the ones. We had a little Google Drive problem. So I'm just gonna talk to you all if you don't mind removing the slides and putting me on the screen. So one of the things that we work really, really hard at Shed Aquarium is making sure that our science is related to our public policy work. In fact, I often talk about science being our North Star. So one of the things that I just want to focus on us today is taking the great discussion that we just had with Lynn and linking it to our priorities around 30 by 30. It is critically important for us to understand what our challenges are and what the solutions look like. We absolutely know that we are experiencing two intersecting crises. So one is a climate crisis, the other is a biodiversity crisis. And Lynn did a great job describing what that looks like in Bahamas and all the way up to the Florida Keys. That is also true for many of us who do work also in freshwater and in the Great Lakes. At Shed, we split our work between work on the Great Lakes and freshwater and with Lynn's great team that does marine biology work. That also means that on the policy side, we split our work based on those two core areas. Functionally though, we're understanding that whether it's climate change or the biodiversity crisis, we need to come up with smart and sustainable solutions that will help us move forward and save our wild spaces and the wild aquatic life that lives there for generations to come. Now we do that by trying to identify the best science-driven public policy. We want to make sure that that public policy is not only science-driven, but also related to and connected to individuals so that it's rooted in the communities that live there and ensures that we are engaged in forward thinking so that it isn't just a one point in time type of activity, but it's one that will last for a long time. An example of that is the great work to protect 30% of aquatic habitat by the year 2030. At Shed, we're concerned about that both in the marine habitat as well as in the freshwater habitat, but today we're focusing on the marine habitat. I want to just highlight though, I get the opportunity to work binationally within the United States federally and with Congress and at the state and local level. And because I get the opportunity not only to work with our colleagues in the Bahamas, but also in Canada, I get to see what great work they're doing up there. So we just had the UN Convention on Biodiversity. It highlighted the critical importance for us globally to protect habitat and to move towards the 30 by 30 goals. Our colleagues in Canada in July made a commitment based on the entire country to move towards the 30 by 30 goals. So protecting 30% of land and water in Canada by the year 2030. We're hoping in the United States to follow their amazing lead. And we're able, and right now, just to give you a little window into what Congress is thinking about, there are two fantastic ways that kind of priorities are being engaged. One is a bill that identifies and lays out a really strategic vision for 30 by 30 by Senator Udall. It's a really fantastic and smart and well-designed bill that lays out the basic outline and principles of why this matters and what we need to move forward. Right now, I will talk later as we get in Q&A about what build numbers are out there and other things, but I want to talk a little bit about the basic framing. There is also another fantastic bill that was launched last week, and that bill focuses on protecting the oceans in the context of the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis. And within that, it focuses very keenly on ensuring that we're protecting marine habitat, because it is that marine habitat that Lynn so well described that is the places that we ensure that we're especially helping those endangered and threatened species. Without protected habitat, there will be more endangered and threatened species, and we won't be able to restore the numbers of aquatic life as we move forward. So those are two amazing things that are happening. But just as I talked about the national work in Canada, there's a lot of great work happening in states from Colorado to California, and hopefully in states like Florida and Illinois. There are discussions right now about how in our states we can advance really smart legislation to protect land and water. In a state like Florida, we have an amazing, and you in Florida have an amazing resource in the Florida Keys. There's been great work through our national marine sanctuaries to protect those Florida keys, but we need to ensure that that stays that way. We also need to ensure that science is driving that. One really a keen way to do that is to ensure that scientists are part of the decision-making process as those marine sanctuaries move forward and identify the specific ways in which protections occurred. The reason why that matters is what Lynn was talking about earlier. You know, there are ways that you can completely protect the habitat, protect it for juveniles, or protect it for reproduction. And we need to ensure that the decisions on how that happens and how our fisheries are engaged with our marine protected areas is informed by science and scientists. As fantastic as folks like me are in trying to move things forward, I like having a scientist like Lynn informing me on what's best practice. The same needs to be true when it comes to national as well as state-based decision-making around marine protected areas. So I want to encourage all of you to think about how you can reach out and encourage your friends and families to talk about this issue, how you can reach out to local elected officials. And one way I want to frame this is in the context of voting. We all know that voting is really important right now, and I want to encourage everyone listening to vote. I also want you to think about what we often talk about when it comes to voting. We talk about planning, because there's a parallel between what we do with voting with marine protected areas and making sure that effective public policy works. So when we talk about planning, when we're talking about voting, we also need to plan when it comes to marine protected areas and 30 by 30, as well as ensuring that we're making a plan to communicate this new vision with our partners. And we need to be persistent. We have to be persistent sometimes to wait in line to vote, but we also need to be persistent when it comes to ensuring that these kind of policies exist. Really importantly about this. So I encourage all of you when it comes to voting to be patient as this election rolls through, but I also encourage you to be patient when we're looking at outcomes. Often folks, when talking about things like 30 by 30, will say, well, we've done it for 1 year and what has happened? We need to have a larger time scale. The harm that's happened took a lot of years to occur. And we don't just turn the spigot back on in terms of protection. I think everything's going to be better. We're going to need to make these commitments for the long term. And in fact, that's why we talk about doing this work for the generations to come and to follow. I'm doing this work not only for my daughter, but for generations after her. I was lucky enough to be able to play freshwater habitat in the Great Lakes. I'm from Michigan, but I also had the opportunity as a young person to meet Jacques Cousteau and his family and get entirely inspired by the oceans, which meant that when I went to places like California and Florida, I made sure I had a snorkel and put my head down and saw the extraordinary universe that was underneath. I've seen in my lifetime, in my 50+ years on this beautiful planet, amazing work happen. I want to ensure that each of you know that each of you, together with folks like Environment America and SHED, can actually make a difference. And we together can ensure that we're protecting 30% of our aquatic habitat and the wildlife that lives there by the year 2030. That will ensure that generations from now, 50 years from now, the folks that live after us will be able to see vibrant, healthy, and thriving habitat. With this, I think we can move forward to questions. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrea, for that presentation. And Lynn, if you also want to turn your camera back on, we can have a Q&A session. Great. Okay, so I know that we've had a couple of questions that have already come in through the chat, so we'll start with those. And then everyone else in the audience right now, feel free to chat your questions directly using that little quote box function, the chat function, and we will get to them in the order that they come in. So, okay. First question, let's see. How much damage from Michael, how much damage was done to the ocean in the last 4 years? And I think another good kind of tail end question to that are, what are some steps that we can take looking forward to protect in the next 4 years, next election cycle? And
so
yeah,
I'm sure Andrea can speak more to policy, but I just wanted to bring up one way in which some recent rollbacks have hurt the ocean is in terms of funding. So when I was a graduate student, I was funded by a fellowship paid for by the National Marine Fisheries Service and Sea Grant. And those programs like that have had to fight tooth and nail to get funded every single year these past 4 years. Sea Grant programs, most states that are on the Great Lakes or on an ocean, they have a program. The programs provide amazing funding opportunities for community engagement, education programs, and also graduate student and college student undergrad level funding. And cuts to programs like that, though, the damage that that causes, we might not see for generations in terms of people that are interested in the ocean and have the opportunity to have a job like me. That opportunity could have been taken away from them. So I really hope that when the next funding cycle comes around, that those programs are no longer on the chopping block. So while that's not directly harming the ocean immediately, in my mind, that has a really long lasting impact in terms of how much people know about the oceans and the type of people who are working in these jobs and the amount of ideas we get from those people.
Yeah, you know, investment over time that's consistent, and Lynn was making this point about protecting areas and keeping them protected. The same is true in terms of financial assistance and commitment. Investment. We don't invest over time, then actually we have reductions in staffing and the kind of folks that need to go out there and ensure that those lands are protected. It also means that we are not tracking over time. Longitudinal data that often organizations like NOAA, as well as scientists like Lynn track, helps us know if we're progressing forward or backwards. Without that longitudinal data, it's really, really hard. And it's actually harder for folks like me to make the point that either we've done well and we need to keep at it, or we're having challenges and we need to increase our investment. If we don't keep a steady investment, it's really hard to continue to have progress. And we have seen in the regulatory, we've seen the, especially when it comes to pollution, when we stop making sure that there's, we're not having pollution into the water, if the pollution begins to happen, it takes a lot more to go in there to clean everything back up. One thing I like saying is that prevention is way cheaper and a much better investment dollar by dollar than is cleaning up and trying to restore problems that have already happened. That's especially true when it comes to species and wildlife and habitat. It's much harder to restore a habitat and to restore a fishery than it is to protect it from the beginning.
Thank you for giving that insight. I think that's a great point about how prevention is a really critical part of the work that we do. Another question that Caroline asked in that same vein is about plastic pollution, which is, what are the effects of plastic pollution on the marine protected areas and how can we work to mitigate this?
Do you want to talk, Lynn, or do you want me to?
I can talk. Some of the direct impacts are, so on coral reefs, if you have large chunks of plastic, they can become entangled and actually cause destruction to the coral reef itself, so destroying habitat. Or abrading off that coral, which makes it easier for algae to take over. Also, we know that a lot of marine animals across, the tiniest plankton up to big fish, they can consume this plastic, and then that causes problems for them with their digestive system. So it has direct impacts in that way. Another really problematic thing, this isn't necessarily plastic pollution, but when people abandon fishing gear, it stays in the water sometimes and it becomes ghost fishing gear. So your traps, your nets can continue, or your hooks snagged on the reef, they can continue to catch things, only they're no longer attached to a human anymore. So we're no longer going to haul them in and keep that catch. So they're just catching things and killing things. So ghost fishing gear can also become incredibly problematic. And also when ghost fishing gear tumbles around the ocean, it can then cause even more destruction.
Pollution, both like plastic pollution and nutrient pollution, can happen from multiple sources. We're talking about Lynn was talking about connectivity, and I like to think about this for both of those types of pollution. And I'm branching this out because I want us to all think about how we're related. We can often see the pollution that comes from Illinois area and the upper Midwest, whether it's nutrient pollution or plastic pollution, finding its way into the Gulf through our rivers and streams. It not only impacts the marine creatures that are in the Gulf of Mexico, or if it runs its way into the Atlantic, but it also impacts all the creatures and habitat and people that live near it in the rivers and streams. And there is an intersection between the impact on humans and the impact on aquatic life. That's both true for nutrient pollution as well as plastic pollution. And it accumulates over time, right? So some goes in, but then more continues to go and add. It's true for both of those things. And I think it's really important to think about that cumulative impact. Just as Lynn was talking about fishing gear, the more of it that's out there, the higher the dose of it. For both nutrient and plastic pollution, there are concerns when it begins to degrade about the impact it has on the water, both for humans who in places like Chicago, our water, the drinking water, the water that comes from Lake Michigan, if there are nutrient or plastic pollution in there that's degrading, right, coming from the petroleum base and any additive, any chemical additive, that then becomes part of our drinking water. Same is true for other pesticides or nutrient pollution. And the same is then true for the mammals and fish that live either in freshwater or in marine habitat. And again, if they're endangered and threatened species in the Florida Keys, we want that water to be as healthy and vibrant for them to live and thrive in. So reducing the amount of pollution is a main priority for all of us.
Yeah, and I think that, point about plastic pollution and reducing the amount of pollution in general speaks back to what Lynn was sharing earlier about the interconnectedness of marine protected areas. It just highlights how all of these systems are so connected, and when we protect one of them, we are taking steps to protect all of them, and that goes both directions. So we have a couple more questions in here. We have one from Sonia, which is, how has water temperature / climate change affected marine protected areas or our oceans in general?
That's a great question. And so I think there's going to be a future, another panel, which will feature hopefully Ross Cunning, another SHED researcher who focuses on corals and the impact of climate change and working to basically save corals from climate change and find out how can they survive in the Caribbean. So stay tuned for that. But then I can answer it in terms of fish. So we've actually seen, Nassau grouper in the Caribbean, they're spawning in the winter when the temperatures are the coolest. So as temperatures get warmer and warmer each year, this is problematic. They're currently, for that species, Nassau grouper, now spawn at temperatures outside the range of when people originally described where do they spawn. They said, oh, they never spawn higher than 26 degrees Celsius. Now it's 27.5 degrees Celsius and they're still spawning. And it continues to get a little bit warmer. So we're not really sure. The problem for a species like Nassau grouper, they're not like sharks, like ocean going sharks, a tiger shark, that could swim from Bahamas to the US, or a dolphin or a whale that have really big ocean migrations. They like to stay near land. They don't go over the deep ocean. So if it gets too warm for them on the islands that they're currently on, they're not going to be able to move, which makes it all that more important for a place like Florida, which is connected by the southeast coast, to protect the species they have, because some models, what they've hypothesized will happen is that as it warms, and we've seen this with other species already, is that they're moving towards the poles. So they're actually shifting their ranges. In the northern hemisphere, they're moving towards the North Pole, shifting it further north to get to those cooler waters. For the southern hemisphere, they're doing the opposite and heading south. For species that can go deeper, another option is to go deeper into the water where it's cooler. But this is problematic. It's also problematic even in the Great Lakes. We already see climate change in the Great Lakes impacting where species are going to.
Something else that we don't often talk about is although we were talking a little bit more of it recently because of extreme weather, is the impact on near shore. And near shore also, when there's increasing water levels, that can actually produce more pollution and many, many challenges. So thinking about how we are really mindful about protecting near shore habitat and near shore coasts in ways that really use green and environmentally sound methods. In the past, we've used a lot of concrete and steel. There are ways to do it that use seagrasses and other deep-rooted, near aquatic green habitat that can assist shorebirds, and it can keep it healthier so that we're not having more pesticides fall in or other pollutants fall in to the ocean or in freshwater space. So that nearshore space is also really important, and how we protect it really matters. What we use, how we do it can make a big difference. It also, by the way, can make a real big difference for humans and can make the space even more inviting for folks to who live near it to be engaged with nature, which I think is really critically important. And I also think it's an issue of racial justice and parity to ensure that we're providing access to all people to wildlife, including our oceans and our lakes and rivers.
Thank you, Andrea, for sharing a little bit more about that relationship. Another question that we have from the audience is about ecosystems. So are there ecosystems we can protect to keep important species safe?
So this is a really great question. And as someone who does work in coral reefs, of course, my tendency is to answer coral reefs, but I think the answer is we need to protect some of everything. So if you've heard too discussions of deep sea mining, and people were like, oh, you can deep sea mine because there's nothing living down there in the mud. And that's totally not true. It might not be the ecosystem I want to study, and it might not be accessible to divers, so a lot of people aren't aware of it. But every single different ecosystem in the ocean has its own unique animals, and they play a really important role. Also, there's a whole group of people and group of scientists who their work is around finding natural products. So there's this whole other idea of we should be saving different areas because who knows what natural product or drug compound we might find that could help humans. So there's a variety of arguments to argue why every ecosystem is important to protect, but I really believe that we need to protect some of each of them, regardless of how interesting it might sound to you, because they are all so unique and special in the organisms that live there and the roles that they play in terms of what they do and what they produce for this planet.
You know, wetlands is a really good example of that. You have and folks in Florida have amazing, extraordinary brackish water, freshwater, and marine habitat that are incredibly interconnected. And protecting wetlands and marine types of wetlands and the brackish water space near to their marine habitat are all critically important. Each one is very important. And in fact, many wetlands in them live things like toads and salamanders and things that are very, very sensitive to changes in climate. And they're also critically important to ensuring that those habitats stay healthy and vibrant for the future. So I think one of the lessons I hope you learn and that we all talk about is how interconnected each one of these pieces are. While we can talk about how extraordinary the Florida Keys are, it's also important to think about what that relationship is, for example, with the Everglades. So each one of those pieces are critically related and connected, and protecting bits of each one is really important. And then maybe the last thing I just want to point on that point is that we can have and do have healthy, vibrant economies and can protect ecosystems. Both those things live together, and I think Lynn's talk and highlighting about how healthy fisheries work is a great example of that.
Yeah, I think thinking about all the undiscovered potential in the oceans, as Lynn was sharing, and then a little bit more about the things that we do know about on land, just really do underscore how important it is to protect these spaces. I know in the Northeast Caymans and Seamounts, another marine protected area, the last time scientists went out there, they discovered 2 new species of coral, and that was just in one trip. So there's so much out there, and if we don't protect it, we could end up losing things that we didn't even know we had and didn't realize how important they were. We have another really great question from Jane Perkins. What are the 5 things the average citizen who cares about these issues can do to promote further education of the 30 by 30 plan? So I think that's a great question for Andrea.
Yeah, I'll start, and Lynn, I know that you'll say a lot. You know, I made the parallel between voting and acting because I want everyone to know that everyone can do something. So you live in a community, you have family and friends that you engage in. If you learned something today, share some of what you learned today with families and friends. If you live or work in schools or have places of worship that you engage in, talk about these issues and why you think they're important for your local economy. Then have conversations locally with your elected officials. I mean, I cannot share how important it is to reach out to whether it's regulators or folks who are trying to, or who are hired, and hired sometimes means that we elect them into office to represent us, to do the work to protect ecosystems. They need to hear from us that it's important, right? They need to know that you care about it. And the more that you can share that with them, and the more frequently you do, the more important it is. And as I have the opportunity on a daily basis to be able to have conversations with those folks, they are moved when you call and tell the story. When your grandkid calls and or sends a painting or a picture that they did, that matters, and they'll remember that. I also really encourage you to talk with folks locally. We often, and we're right now having, discussions in the bills about bills in Congress, and that's really important. It's a lot of the work that I do every day, but it's also really important what happens in our townships, in our cities, in our counties. It also really matters what happens in our states. Those folks also need to know that we care about these issues, and we want them to work with us to come up with solutions. And the last thing I'll say is that there are many opportunities for citizens to sit on boards and working groups that are coming up with decisions in your local community about how to protect and restore habitat. Join those, raise your voice, and work with organizations like Environment America and SHED. We're happy to have you join us in raising our voices together.
Yeah, I think I really like, I think that those are all really incredible ideas. And just to, as you're talking about raising our voices, it reminds me of a project that Environment America launched this fall called Voices for Our Oceans. And so that's just a program where we're running that trains activists on how to raise their voices to our decision makers. So I'll share the legislation link potentially in the chat. And we would love to have motivated citizens who are interested in becoming ocean activists join us. So we run a series of activist trainings. We do webinars similar to this one, and have a lot of opportunities for folks who want to protect the oceans to do just that.
I was just going to add another great step that you can take that's pretty simple is acknowledging the groups and also countries or cities that are leaders in this. So I didn't talk at all about this, but so the Bahamas, they're an MPA of sorts for sharks. So Bahamas are actually a shark sanctuary. So it's illegal to kill sharks anywhere in the entire Bahamas. So a project that SHED started, I think, a year or two ago was actually this online just gathering signatures for people to thank the Bahamas, to say, this is amazing that you've done this. I'm not sure if our website's still live to add to those thank yous. But you can also just thank the groups or countries that have fantastic MPAs and are choosing to protect the environment over possibly doing something different, whether it be a country, a city, or a small group, that's cleaning up an area or fighting to protect it. I think giving them thanks or offering them help is always well received.
If you don't mind, I just want to follow up to say, those folks who use social media, that's a great way to do the thank you. It's also great to pick up the phone and call. It's also great to send a letter. But social media is a really fun way to do it. So if someone just did something that you really like, tagging them, so tagging someone that just did something brilliant, or that agents, like state agency or federal agency that did something brilliant, and saying thank you. It not only lets them know that you're thanking them, but it lets other folks know what they did that was good. And I really think it's really important, especially in challenging days like now, for us to lift up the things that are working, for us to lean into the asset-based and positive activities, and to really share those and amplify them, and encourage that we don't go backwards, right? When things work, let's keep going that way, and let's figure out how to make them work even better. Let's not go backwards towards things that we know didn't work. But if we amplify and share and celebrate those great things, Lynn, that's a perfect example of being able to encourage folks to move towards a future that's way more sustainable for generations to come.
Absolutely. And to bring it back to the Florida Keys a little bit, which is also in theme with what you were just sharing about thanking and celebrating. So the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary is a protected sanctuary, which is awesome. But we do want the protections to be stronger. So I think we're getting close to 5 things to do, but maybe for number 4 and number 5 will be to write to your federal agency and let them know that you want stronger protections for the Florida Keys that will, keep up the great work that they've done, and then just increase the resilience and increase the restoration of that space.
It really is especially important right now for us to raise our voice and for our friends, our federal agencies to know how much it matters. So I encourage all of you, there's the link in the chat box right now, and I really encourage you to use that, to share that, and to put details in there. So here's a little inside tip. If you are encouraged to send a letter and you are given a script, if you add just a little bit of personal stories, like Michaela started the top with a personal story. I gave you a little bit of background on why I do what I do today. That really matters, and it honestly sticks with regulators and policymakers alike. Well, heck, it matters with me, right? And if you tell me a story, I'm now going to know something about Michaela that I didn't know before, and I'll remember that. That's why stories work and matter, because they connect us as humans, and the more that we can do that, the greater the impact. So I really encourage folks to do that kind of work.
We have time for a couple more questions, and so one I am seeing right now is our groupers important for coral ecosystems as a whole? And I think that one is pretty clearly Lynn, but if Andrea also wants to jump in, there's room for that too.
So yeah, that's a really fantastic question. And there were some studies done. Mumby was one of the lead authors on this study, but he found, so NASA groupers, also your black grouper, Goliath grouper, so your large groupers, the top predators, they actually play an important role in that they eat other smaller groupers. And those small groupers actually eat the algae eaters, so your parrotfish. So if you have a lot of NASA groupers, it relieves the predation on parrotfish and other algal eaters, which are really important to keep those fish alive because they're keeping the coral reefs clean to keep algae from taking over the reef. So they found out that if your NASA grouper populations drop, your parrotfish and other algal eaters are also going to drop in number. So having healthy top reef predators like the NASA grouper, like your black grouper or your Goliath grouper is really important because it actually helps out coral reefs, which is pretty cool. The other flip side is when NASA groupers spawn, the females release millions of eggs. And so there's lots of gametes, which is basically nutrition for other things in the water. And this is true of other species when it's time to reproduce. It's not just producing the next generation of offspring that grew up, it's just the food they're putting out there for the environment or the nutrients. So this has been shown to be important even for things that spawn in rivers. But great question, that was very exciting.
No, I love learning about the species that, are not the necessarily charismatic megafauna, but still play a really critical role. And it sounds like groupers are one of those species. Great. Okay. So if there are any last minute, it looks like we have gotten through most of the questions, but if anyone has any last minute ones, we have a couple more moments to answer that. Otherwise, we can wrap up a little bit, a couple minutes early this evening.
If you don't mind, one thing I do want to remind everyone is that we'll have the opportunity in 2021, regardless of how the election goes, to have ever more impact on protecting our aquatic habitat. So now is really the time to begin having these conversations, to talk with your friends and family, to sign petitions like the one you just saw here, to share with our policymakers why it matters. Things will begin moving really quickly in the beginning of next year. And our policy needs to hear directly from you that you really care about protecting 30% of our aquatic habitat by the year 2030. And as Lynn made the point, we need to start doing that today in order for us to have a lasting impact.
Great. Thank you again, Andrea. That was a great way to conclude the program. And thank you, Lynn, too. And thank you all of you for joining us this evening to learn more about the Florida Keys and marine protected areas in general, and how you can help protect more of these spaces so we can have healthy oceans and healthy sea animals for the rest of our lives and future generations' lives. Well, enjoy the rest of your Tuesday evening. We will be in touch after with an email that contains some action links, so keep an eye out for that. And we're looking forward to continuing to collaborate with ocean activists like yourself to protect more of our oceans. Bye, everyone.